The fixation on Gaza, I mean, to a certain extent, is obviously led by the reality of the events and the horror there.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it's very much informed by the fact that there's nothing going on.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
Alex Hochuli is the podcaster at the Aufhebunga Bunga podcast. He has big news about what's going on at the Bunga cast, which is why he's here. And also, he's the author, from as far as I'm concerned, of the most important thing you've ever written, is Omelets and Eggshells on the Failure of the Millennial Left, which is a review of Chris Catrone's book, which we published here at Sublation Media. So, Alex, welcome to the Diet Soap podcast again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. I'm excited to be here, though a little bit, already starting up on the wrong foot, telling me that's the best thing I've ever written. It's just a review of other people's work. Well,
Yeah. No, I'm just joking. I'm just joshing. But yeah, I think there was a book that you wrote that was even better than that, which was called The End of History, which we published.
Which you published. Yeah. Well,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But anyway, they're part of the same discussion, right?
Right.
It's about, the end of history is broader than just the question of the millennial left, but secondary theme is the millennial left and a history of the past 10, 15 years. And so I guess I'm kind of continuing that, and the books that I review are a continuation also of that same discussion and critique of a wasted decade.
Yeah. Do you think it was entirely wasted? Do you think that there was something we could salvage from it now?
To get into it, I worry that it was maybe the most negative interpretation is that it's worse than useless. So I mean that in the sense that it rekindled a belief that political power could be won quickly through what the authors of one of the books call the populist gamble. That basically you get a charismatic figure who is able to somehow act as a repository for all your hopes and dreams and ambitions for political change, and that they might then be elected really quickly. If you just throw all your energy into it, they'll be elected as president or prime minister, and through the stroke of a pen, we can reverse all the bad neoliberal things that we don't like. And so insofar as it built in that expectation that could work, I think it would be worse than useless. Otherwise, you try, you fail, that's fine. Important thing to learn the lessons. I try in my essay to at least point to what we should be talking about, or at least what I think we should be talking about, and the lessons that we should learn. And I think, the books themselves are useful in that regard. I try to bring them out in a maybe more pointed fashion than most of those books do. But I guess that's that's a point of a review.
Mm-hmm. Well, so let's go over some old ground, and you can refresh my memory about the title of your book at Zero, because I think it's worth doing. The end of history. The end of history was Fukuyama's phrase from the collapse of the Soviet Union on. We were meant to be in this era of liberalism triumphant. The next American century might be another way to think of it. But to declare the end of history might seem like a positive thing for people who wanted to see American power diminished and might want to break from a neoliberal order. But it didn't have that positive connotation when you wrote about it. right? I mean, how did you think of the end of the end of
I
history?
mean, positive insofar relative to the period of the end of history, or the long 1990s, as it's been called, the era of peak globalization, of American unipolarity. To the extent that it's a departure from that, because all those things are eroding, falling apart, collapsing, it is positive because it opens a window. Whatever. They plus talk of Overton windows, which I think accompanied this, that the possibilities for politics were, if not wider in terms of like the offering available in electoral politics, but just simply that the falling apart of the old needed to happen. So it's good that it is happening. And that is like trying to rescue a positive from it. The end of history signified also, Kiyama understood it, as we've discussed before, and I think people are aware of, was fairly gloomy about the situation because although his side had won, he saw it as the end of any heroic attempts to really drastically change the world. And so it's a kind of resignation to this kind of low-key utopia of consumerism, individual freedom, electoral democracy, and so on, but nothing grand and heroic and really historic, obviously, anymore. And I think, the end of history signifies not necessarily the return of anything heroic, but it does, I think, importantly mean that that what used to exist as an optimistic vision of capitalism, where capitalism's main advocates were relatively sunny, still, despite the gloominess, still a sense that a rising tide lifts all boats, that this was a kind of universal and all-encompassing vision, which everybody had to buy into, because what the fuck else are you going to do? Right? Like there's no other alternative. So, but there's no alternative, but the thing we have is good, and it's good for everybody. I don't think capitalism's advocates nowadays even do that, right? It's increasingly a sense of, well, we need to, for the winners, it's good, and for the losers, unlucky. And actually the number of winners is smaller than the number of losers. And that's the future. So I don't think there's any promise anymore, even amongst the system's defenders, that this is, that there can be some vision that encompasses everyone and that can make any kind of real promises. So on the one hand, that makes it difficult because we don't have a kind of vision put forward from the mainstream, from public authorities, which we can hold them account to. Right. So this is a world of no promises. But on the other hand, I think it falls to us to kind of spell out a more progressive vision, right? Because no one's buying capitalism, right? No one's in favor of capitalism anymore. I actually posted on I have a new Substack, which is free. It's mainly just a blog for getting kind of ideas out there and putting stuff down on paper. But I wrote a thing, I think, this week about how leftists, at least in their best kind of best current integument, which is to say the kind of new dealers, green new dealers, that type of thinking, are the last believers in capitalism, because they're the last one to believe that we can have endless accumulation and incorporate the working class and incorporate the newly precarious sections of the working class into a positive and ever rising sort of social order. So ironically, it's only kind of the kind of materialist, social democratic, or democratic socialist in quotation marks, left that is still pro-capitalist and optimistic about capitalism.
Well, I found myself in the last year, particularly, trying to remind people that we were promised at least stability, and that vision of the way I think of it is the vision from the old movie Network, where, do you remember that movie?
I haven't seen that. No.
Oh my gosh. I forget how old I am. It was like 1976 movie. Patty Chayefsky. I might run.
You can watch movies from any time. You don't need a.
That's true. But I was, I didn't see it then. I was 5 then. But in it, there's a news anchor who has a nervous breakdown, and he starts proselytizing about how people need to stand up for themselves and make changes in the world. And the owner of the network brings him in and tells him that he doesn't understand how the world works. He shouldn't get in the way of business deals. He needs to tell people that they're no longer nations, they're no longer peoples, they're no longer ethnicities. There's just AT&T and DuPont and all these international conglomerates, and the world is run by dollars and pounds and yen, and that's for the best, because soon we'll be living in a world without wars, without conflicts, without hungers. Every need will be satisfied. Every desire will be, and for amusement will be obtained. Our children won't know suffering, and capitalism will bring on a kind of conformist utopia. And it's just sinister. It was a sinister scene in 1976, but now I look back on it longingly. It's like,
Right.
if only we had these capitalists who were trying to avoid world conflict and who had some belief in their own ideology. So I feel like my job lately is to say, hey, remember when we used to care about, free speech and our own individual rights, and also remember when we were promised that that the end of history, no, not the end of the end of history, but that the end of history had arrived, and we were going to bring Russia in, and that we were past the Cold War, and the nuclear conflicts that we were all concerned about were a thing of the past. Remember all that? What happened? Why should we accept this world we're in now, given what we were promised in the past? And I do think that the danger in being too optimistic about the end of history is that we forget what the promises of the capitalist order were, and kind of cynically take up the current moment on its own terms.
I think that's a good point. No, absolutely. I think that is a good point. It's not optimism, certainly. That's not the right way to put it, but it's a feeling and a belief that that the neoliberal order necessarily has to fall apart, that it doesn't. And so to the extent that is accelerated, I'm not like an accelerationist or for that matter, an advocate of the worse, the better, but just simply that it's something which will fall apart. And the faster it does, the better, because we need to move on to something else. Now, it still remains up to us, up to politics to try to change things, and to try to, at least in some way, to respond to or try to seek to control the historical trajectory. But the point is that it's something that's falling apart. And really, what we're confronted with is, as I think it was Colin Crouch put it in his book in 2011, way back, the strange non-death of neoliberalism. We're still there, right? There's been inching past it on the kind of political economic front, but actually socially, a lot of things that are associated with neoliberalism have only deepened. And I suspect, unless there is some very major reform to the system and probably actually some revolutionary change, that will only continue to deepen, because a lot of the things that we call neoliberal that we often don't like in terms of social atomization or commodification are not neoliberal. Neoliberalism was the form it was introduced and accelerated and helped break down a lot of the kind of barriers that were put up in the post-war period, things which kind of set some limits to commodification, for example. Those barriers have been knocked down over the past year. So even if we move to something a little bit more statist and protectionist as a social system, there's no reason to expect that those other aspects of kind of the deepening of capitalist social relations, both widening and deepening, there's no reason to expect that will change. But anyway, I think we're maybe kind of moving beyond.
No, right. But when did you write The End of History? Was it in?
So it came out in 2021, but we were writing it already from mid 2019. As our friend and colleague Lee Jones encouraged us to write a book, kind of resuming everything that we've been talking about on the podcast, to write the book about the end of history. And then we were kind of putting the finishing touches on it in early 2020. So we managed to already be able to reflect on the pandemic and the lockdowns without really fully seeing the full consequences of it. But we already had a sense that was putting paid to this left populist moment, or to the millennial left. So I think we were just late enough to be able to get that.
And you're right on that front, I think.
Yeah.
So in a way, that book marked the completion of some part of the Bunga cast project, right? Not like you were turning in your guns or anything, but that you were able now at that point to look back and reflect on what had happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And certainly in terms of trying to not just explicate, but to fill in all the kind of elements of what the end of history is and was, I think we were able at that point to do that already. Now, I think that was important. And then since then, we've obviously continued our discussions, but probably loosened the strings a little bit in terms of what we discuss. But I mean, the podcast remains the same in terms of our objective to understand the breakdown of the neoliberal order, chart what comes next, reckon with a world which is increasingly turbulent, and particularly in the geopolitical realm, increasingly and very obviously so. That's something that has massively accelerated in the past 40 years. And also the sense of ideological confusion has only deepened. The way that you have not just in terms of, though it's spoken about in the US in terms of de-alignment or realignment politically, but, in a much deeper sense, the idea of something like MAGA communism, to use something that's a bit of a meme, but like even that it has an element of ideological confusion, or the way that, in Argentina, a rebel against the neoliberal of kind of the order that has reigned over the past 30, 40 years, maybe longer in Argentina, actually takes the form of like this extreme libertarianism. Whereas in the US, it might take the form of Trumpism, which has its protectionist elements. So all these things which are very kind of confused and maybe fusionistic. So that still needs to be untangled and explained. So that's what we're continuing to do. And I mean, I know you gave me a little cue maybe to talk about it. Maybe I'll do that now briefly.
Yeah, let me ask the question, and then what I was going to say is you are going through big changes now at the Bunga Cast. You're bringing in some new people and you're aligning with them or merging with or working with Damage.
Partnership.
Partnership with them. And so do you feel like this is a moment where you're looking back at what has come up to this point and making a change based on those reflections? And if so, what's brought on the partnership, the bringing in of these particular new hosts, and how is your vision being changed by this, if it is at all?
Well, I mean, I think partly it's us and me, maybe in particular, wanting to do more, just simply to do more podcasts, more discussions, because I feel like, doing one episode a week isn't enough. Like there are so many different areas to be explored. And so part of it is wanting to broaden out the coverage. And so talk more about arts and culture on the one hand, talk more about, psychoanalytic interpretations, which, Damage Magazine's kind of history is in that. Talk more about science, technology, the built environment, climate change, industry, things which maybe we haven't dealt with. I'm working on an episode putting together something on the crisis at Boeing, for example, which I think is very indicative of kind of of a decline in American industrialism, but trying to look kind of a little bit more, trying to look more broadly. But also, I think, so the motivation was maybe more internal, but the idea is, in bringing in all the kind of regular contributors that we're going to have. So Amber Lee Frost, Alex Gurovich, Lee Phillips, and Catherine Liu, as well as with a partnership with Damage, is that it's a way of going, okay, actually what we need now is probably a more thoroughgoing critique, even more so than I think we have been doing. I think people would identify us as not necessarily like maybe pulling any punches or anything, but that the crisis is such, and the opportunities for political action kind of relatively scant at the moment, that I think we need to be potentially like not just be broad in the way that we look at things and in the areas that we look at, but that's part of it, because I think the what's falling apart is the whole 20th century, and I mean that's weird to put it in maybe a temporal sense, but so much that is associated with the 20th century, and even indeed in the 19th century, is coming apart. So like what we know of as journalism, or of the law, or what kind of, we mainly confined our discussions to politics, but obviously that's falling apart in terms of political parties, the way that elections take place, competition between center left and center right. That stuff I think is already fairly obvious and was a major plank of what we would regularly discuss on BungaCast over the first, we started in 2017, so 2017 to 2020, 2022. But so many other areas seem to be kind of transforming, falling apart, eroding. And there are things that we really take for granted. Things that like pop music, spectator sports, particularly like if you think about football, the kind of most popular game in the world, soccer, maybe for your American listeners, a lot of that, which we take for granted, we just think like, yeah, that's how stuff is, right? That's how that will always kind of be there. Even that is completely transforming. So I think we need to reckon with that and also be very searching and thoroughgoing in and be willing to kind of go, actually, maybe we need to abandon a lot of the things that we took for granted, and whether maybe that means going back to 1830 or the beginning of the 19th century, the period after the French Revolution, because I think to a certain extent, we're still in modern times, right? We haven't, obviously there's also discussion about postmodern. I prefer the term hypermodern, but the point is that we're not in a feudal situation. We haven't gone back prior to the French Revolution. It's still modernity, it's still capitalism, but things have changed and are changing so fundamentally that maybe we need to rethink things from the ground up. And so I think we're trying to be willing to do that. And, kind of to touch back on the question of the Millennial Left, one of the things that I wanted to urge in the article and to bring out from the books, which I think are maybe latent there, is that there's no going back or repeating or trying to go, actually, maybe we just try to rerun this, but improve our tactics, which I think is what the left tends to do, to just be like, let's make these tactical improvements. Let's organize better. Let's knock on more doors. Let's blah, 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 blah. And rather than rethink things from the ground up. Because, the left already died a long time ago. The working class was defeated in the 1980s. So the idea that we can just restart left politics now, pretending that never happened, is wrong. And things have died even further, decomposed even further since 1989.
Well, so tell me about the hosts that you're bringing in and how they, like, what I'd really like to know, this is so typically leftist of me. It's the worst, probably. Tell me what's the ideology of each one of these people? Who do they represent? How can I categorize them?
I'm not going to be doing that because I certainly don't want to speak for them.
Which one's the Stalinist? Which one's the anarchist? Which one's the Maoist? Come on,
I'll be happy to say that none of them is any of those things. So,
okay, good. That's good.
So that's good. No, I mean, I think we come from, what's interesting, I think we have different interests and backgrounds and kind of areas of knowledge. So Lee Phillips is, been a science journalist for a long time. His expertise is writing on these questions of environment, climate change. He's now kind of becoming a geologist. So anyway, his interest is more scientific. So I think that'll be really cool to be able to have more discussions on areas like that, because the three of us who started the podcast, George, Phil, and myself, are all, social science, humanities people who studied politics, philosophy, etc. At university, and that's our main area of interest. So to be able to broaden out, Catherine Yu teaches film and TV, and kind of a humanities academic. Amber Lee Frost, I think many people will know from Chapo, and kind of has wide ranging interest, and is just a good fun person to talk to, and is also just interested in a lot of kind of in literature and culture. And then Alex Gurevich is a political theory professor at Brown University, and one of the sharpest political theorists around, I think. So people who I think we share, I would say, obviously share certain first principles, I guess, in terms of materialism, humanism, universalism, which would be kind of non-negotiable. But we're all kind of willing to have discussions about different things, and hopefully can kind of continue having very much the kind of bunga approach to things, and being kind of serious and critical about the world today, but be also more wide ranging in the areas that we pick up on.
You mentioned earlier that you thought the 20th century and maybe even the 19th century ways of life were falling apart. Is that something that perspective, something you all share?
Good question. I would suspect, I would suspect probably not. I mean, or maybe it would vary to certain degrees. It actually makes me think of maybe we should maybe do an episode on that, because we did actually for one of our anniversary episode. I think for our 200th episode, I got a whole range of contributors together to talk about what country most exemplified the experience of the 20th century and the early 21st century. But it might be a good opportunity also now to think back at like kind of how, where, and why the 20th century is coming apart. Because I think it really is fundamental. I'm struck by it more every day. Obviously, artificial intelligence is, in terms of its public visibility, is like in its early days, and yet what we have seen over the past 2 years or something is like a radically accelerated sort of time frame. And so the way that plays itself out, and the way that so many things that we consider middle class jobs, maybe, which might be not totally automated out of existence, because I'm not one of those people who thinks that the machines are going to come for your job. More likely, there'll be jobs lost, but also you'll be increasingly working for the machine. So the machine becomes your new boss. But these are all elements which I think need to be considered in a very serious way, and which I think neither the accelerationists nor those wanting to kind of just put a little brake on it, some little regulatory brake, I think deal with it in a deep way it deserves, I think. But yeah, I don't know it's a good question. Such a good question to be returned to, like, to what extent is the 20th century kind of ending and its ways of life and areas of knowledge even, which are kind of eroding.
I find myself wanting to resist some of the changes, right? You mentioned, for instance, one of the ones that I've become very fixated on, and is the death of journalism, which is something that a few years back I thought, I had someone write a book for us called about the death of journalism, and it did pretty well. But I didn't think that it was a revelation. But then I don't think I took the depth of the need for journalism as seriously as I should have at that point. And now it's not just AI, but it's AI coming at the same time that some major moves to control the internet and journalism have been implemented by not just the United States, but by the EU and a variety of nations. This is coming together in a way it's actually kind of frightening. The example that comes to mind for me is something from Matt Taibbi, where he went to the Gemini, which is this new, I think it's Google's AI, and he asked the AI, so tell me about Matt Taibbi's scandals. What kind of scandals has he been through? And the AI made up stories, like articles that he had written that were scandalous, just completely out of whole cloth. Wow. And told a pretty elaborate story about an article he had never actually written, where he compared the CEOs or hedge fund managers of some finance companies. He said that if they wanted to overcome their public relations debacle, they should hire CEOs who don't have noses that look like penises. Well, of course, he didn't say that, right? The AI just made that up, but that was supposedly anti-Semitic according to the AI. And the point of it all is not, I'm repeating this complete lie about him now. I actually feel bad about that. But
the AI is going to read this and be like, well, okay, that it's definitely true,
I can cite Doug Lane citing me. So it's that we're living in a moment where by algorithm, smear campaigns and disinformation can be released from the most powerful institutions in the world, and with the full backing of the intelligence communities around the world as well. So we're basically living through the death of independent journalism and the death of the idea of internal ethics and responsibility. Because along with these implements of control and the algorithmically controlled creation of news, we're also losing the journalists themselves, the people who would be there to hold each other and themselves to some sort of standard. So do you think I'm paranoid about that? You think this is going to...
No, I mean, I think like, if, Obama talked, I think after he was president, so this was in the kind of past decade or something, talked about an epistemological crisis, right? A crisis in how we know what we know. And of course, that is just the perspective from the elite saying, actually, people don't trust us and don't believe us anymore. How do we get them to stop believing these quote unquote conspiracy theories? In many cases, they are actually just a more accurate reflection of the world. And in many cases, those responsible for that is the elite, which has told outright lies and engaged in a whole lot of gaslighting of people, which probably the greatest accelerator of that has been the pandemic. So I'm no like anti-vaxxer or whatever, but just the way that things were stated as the absolute truth, only to be revised the next day, and then you'd be told that actually, no, how could you believe that prior thing? You're a conspiracy theorist, even though it was the same authority saying that. So that whole process, obviously, I think, it's something that's been pretty widely discussed, right? I think people are familiar with this idea, but something maybe, deeper than that is that the shift of like postmodernism is in part spoken of as the shift from text to image, right? But we will have had maybe 50 years of the preponderance and predominance of the image as something which takes the place of text, but it's also something that you can believe in, right? Like an image sure can be manipulated, but if it's been manipulated. But now, surely we're in the dying days of that, where an image can actually be believed. Any video, any image is completely falsifiable, or will be very shortly. And therefore it's something that we put a lot of story in as evidence, right? That humanitarian atrocities are being committed in a war, for example. None of that's going to be credible very soon. And that's right. That's fundamental. When has humanity gone through such a fundamental, like epistemological crisis as that? I don't know, probably since the Enlightenment or something. Potentially we're on the cusp of a transformation, which is, of a 300-year history coming to an end or more. This is speculative on my part. I don't know enough about this stuff to really comment, but I just trying to illustrate the depths of the changes going on. And you can chart them at several levels. So you have the end of history. So the end of the long 90s. You have the end, maybe, or even on a more limited scale, the end of the 2020s, the end of the period of populism, right? The end of the populist decade. But then you also have the end of the long 90s, of the end of history. And then you maybe have the end of the 20th century, but you maybe have the end of the 19th and 20th century, or the end of modernity in a much more thoroughgoing way than any of the heralds of post-modernity talked about in the 70s and 80s.
So if it does turn out that, because I'm thinking about your comment about how video evidence will no longer be reliable, will no longer have authority. And I think that's true. Being kind of a half kook, I've been following the UFO stories for quite a while. And the question of how good is your video evidence is always, front in the forefront of any discussion of whatever the latest sighting might have been. So you get this footage coming in, and then the people come along to debunk it, and they try to look for evidence of manipulation. And the ability for someone who's very skilled to create a fake UFO sighting was already, even a decade ago, fairly advanced. It was more and more difficult to spot a fake, but it was possible. Do you think the AI manipulation will make it less possible for experts with, computer analysis to spot the fake, or do you think it's more about how it won't just be UFO footage anymore that we have to?
Well, I suspect it's the latter, though. I'm not the person to ask, really. I have no technical knowledge to bring to bear on this, but that seems to be the case. And there's other ways. I think, we're talking about the crisis of journalism, and probably I also at certain points underestimated how fundamental that is, just because it's an exercise in the production, right? It's like an industrial process of manufacture of new knowledge, right? Of up-to-date knowledge about what's going on. and often, on a local level, up to kind of national level. And I mean, this is again a bit off the top of my head, but if the large language models are feeding off only what is existing and can't really create anything new, if we're also creating less new knowledge about the world, and just in terms of there's no local newspapers anymore, or they're not funded in any significant way to be able to have a staff of local reporters on local beats reporting on the police, on labor issues, on what's going on at City Hall, and blah 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 blah. That also, there's a possibility that what happens if we really enter into this cycle of just regurgitating everything that's already been produced as a kind of far more serious reflection of what's already happened with cinema and with pop music, of just regurgitating past styles, or literally repeating, trying to endlessly extend the same cinematic universe, or endlessly creating sequels, or repeating musical styles which were in fashion not just 20 years ago, but often 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I said to someone recently that we're trying to be an imprint around critical theory. We're trying to produce criticism at a time when we don't have the original reporting to reflect upon. We don't have, we can't do reality testing very well because we don't have journalism. So now our theories are just sort of, when we try to take a Marxist perspective on world events, the first thing we have to critique is the fact that we don't have any good access to information about world events. Like the Nord Stream pipeline would be an example of a story where we've been told multiple things, multiple times by different people, and there really isn't going to be, it doesn't seem, any final consensus where we'll have that information available to us. Or another example would be the COVID origin story. Like that's gone around and around through several news cycles, but without any conclusive evidence being finally produced. Even when there's reports that there is something conclusive to look at, that somehow gets shifted away over time. So like there was a story that the outbreak started in the Wuhan lab, right? And that patient 0 was a technician there. But then that was denied and kind of shuffled away. And now I'm feeling like, the new consensus is that it was a natural origin is still the thing you're supposed to believe. And so I do worry, and I feel like I'm becoming the very people I want to criticize, because I've been on a war against the war on disinformation. But I feel like I want to hold out for some reporting that would actually get to the facts, and that could be the basis for our understanding.
Yeah, I mean, well, for sure, I think we're in a situation where the let me see if I get this right, because there's a lot of negatives, but the anti-disinformation people, which is to say generally the kind of more associated with the right, it's kind of right coded.
Actually, those are the anti-disinformation people.
Right. Sorry. Yeah, that's yeah. Okay. And it, end up are not necessarily the best advocates for truth, and aren't, people who are wedded to some very serious notion of truth. Often, in fact, their politics are based on myth and the role of the creation of myth, particularly in kind of more neo-reactionary circles. So there's actually very few people. I mean, this sounds kind of fusty as a thing to say, but there's no one standing up for truth anymore, which I kind of cringe hearing myself say that. But if we think about it, well, the kind of technocratic elites aren't interested in that. They're, supposed right-wing challengers who are effectively now, His Majesty's loyal opposition. They're not really interested in truth. And most of the kind of progressive or radical left isn't either. So, I think there's relatively few people out there, probably Marxist critics like ourselves, maybe some post-liberals and whatever, who would be talking about the importance of truth.
What do you make of the fact that in the United States, there's talk of a realignment, in the parties, but there's also seems to me to be a fracturing and also a kind of a of the left itself. Like we went through a period of time where it was pretty much mandatory to be very concerned about populism and Trump if you were on the left, to be opposed to the alt-right and to take on an anti-fascist perspective. Not like that anyone on the left ever was pro-fascist, but that to conceive of your politics in terms of combating fascism and combating Trump and the populace was in one way or another kind of mandatory, even if you were somewhat dissident and wanted to argue that by taking up a class politics, that would be a more effective way to combat the right. But now it seems as though the left is broken into pieces. Like you said, there was MAGA communism now. There's quite a lot of emphasis on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are leftists taking both sides of the war in Ukraine, some pro-Putin leftists and very gung-ho defenders of Zelensky and the Ukrainian side of that conflict. Do you think that the fragmentation of the left's own perspectives might be helpful, in terms of like the ending of the end of history, or is this just confusion that we're experiencing?
So I think in some ways the left populist period provided a temporary reinvigoration, coherence to a left that was otherwise probably fragmenting anyway. I mean, in a general sense, it was revived by a sense of general revolt, even if it was limited in certain cases to the educated middle classes, albeit downwardly mobile, or in a much broader sense as well. Lots of working class support for Bernie Sanders, etc. Or even, just the simple fact that there was a populist moment, even if that went to the right rather than to the left, that testified to a moment of revolt, of popular revolt in the 2010s. So the left served that way, but if you hypothetically were to remove that, I think the left would have continued its fragmentation and in many cases derangement. I think that now that fragmentation is probably necessary. I mean, and here to be unpopular, I think the fixation on Gaza, to a certain extent, is obviously led by the reality of the events and the horror there.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it's very much informed by the fact that there's nothing going on.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.